Yeah, that's right, y'all. Welcome to another episode of Civic Cipher. I'm your host, Ramses Ja, and big shout out to Q Ward, who is still dealing with the real. But, true to form, we are still bringing you everything that is newsworthy and noteworthy in the world of black and brown folks. And this show has been a long time coming. Q and I talked about this issue once or twice on the show so far, but plenty of times behind the scenes. And, I really didn't know how to script the show like the one that I want to do today. And it wasn't until I sat down with a friend of mine recently over the holidays, and we got to talking about some things that took place in the past, but led to some incarceration. And, on the show here, we've discussed, prison reform. We've discussed things like, do prisons work? But, we haven't really gone into detail about that. And as it turns out, a lot of my friends are brilliant people, but none quite as brilliant as my friend Gonzo, who's decided to join me today on Civic Cipher. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So
appreciate the vote of confidence there.
Absolutely. So, let's, I know that you are not just this thing.
Correct.
We've known each other since we were children. But for today's purposes, we're going to talk about one facet of what I believe to be a very rich life that you live. And so I certainly don't want to reduce you to just an inmate, but I do want you to discuss your time as an inmate and your relationship with the prison system so that we can bring our listeners up to speed and they'll know who they're talking to.
Well, definitely. As you said, I try to live a full life. I'm just not, the incarcerated number that they decide to give you. It does actually play, though, a large part in the overall development of my life.
Sure.
So, to speak to that, I've done, I went through a period in my life where I felt like I had to do crime because I had been convicted of a crime. And so upon getting out of, prison, your options are limited.
Sure.
I mean, so the mindset of a young man at that time. So sure. I figured, well, I may as well commit more crime, got into a lot of fraud. I ended up doing, longest extent of, I did about a 4-year stretch.
Okay.
So within that time, I've seen a lot of different things. I've seen a lot of policy that has affected other people that I care about, not only myself, and how the laws are changed and how they're kind of skewed to actually target our community.
Yeah.
So, as far as that, I try to live my life as best I can and put the past behind me. But, when I see programs like yourself and gentlemen out there trying to make a difference in our community, it's just something that needs to be addressed. Because I don't think the public truly understands, the debauchery that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, sure.
And how the system is almost skewed in a way to kind of keep people incarcerated.
Absolutely. Now, you've been in and out a handful of times. Can you describe the different places that you've been? I know you went to a jail one time and then a prison a different time.
Yeah, definitely. The difference between jail and prison.
Sure.
So jail is where you will wait to basically you're charged, you're arrested, and if you can't make bail, or you're not, they call it where if you're OR'd, sometimes you're released on your own recognizance.
Okay. If
you can't make that, you have to in turn put up a bail,
yeah.
which is its whole other system of funny, exciting ways to go. But for there, then you sit in the county.
Okay.
So at one point, I know a lot of Arizonians, if they're familiar with it, was Sheriff Joe.
Okay.
So and then there's various jails that I've been to. I've done my tour of a lot of them.
Okay.
So there's Lower Buckeye Jail, there's downtown, there's Madison. And then these are where you await to where you ultimately go to trial or where most people sign a plea bargain deal.
Okay.
Or, if you're found innocent, or sometimes you usually reduce. I think they have a 95% conviction rate.
Wow.
So, yeah.
I read something about that not too long ago, and that's kind of a phenomenon. It's just a weird little quirk of the criminal justice system in this country, at least, where a lot of cases never go to trial because, folks will try to. They'll take a plea deal and admit that they did something, sometimes that they didn't even do, to avoid going to trial. So there's this idea, and we saw that with they now call them the exonerated five, but it's the Central Park Five that they may be more commonly known as, and they did a movie on Netflix, When They See Us. But you saw these people admitting to crimes that they didn't commit because of police coercion, etc., and ending up doing prison sentences, accepting plea deals that they shouldn't have taken anyway. And this is something that actually has happened to one of my older brothers. He actually went to prison for 12 years. He was there was some issue, a confrontation in a parking lot. This was back when the new Escalade came out, and he had a gun on him. California, there's a lot of carjackings, so he had a gun in the car. He pulled the gun out and shot the gun in the air to scare the guys off from messing with his wife, and it was on video. But they, for some reason, they couldn't submit the video in court.
Sometimes there's lawyer posturing. Sometimes to get certain evidence thrown out.
Sure, and so they couldn't submit the video of him shooting the gun in the air. And so what it ended up being an attempted murder case that he had to fight, as opposed to just discharging a weapon to scare these guys off. And so he was looking at 18 years, but he could plead a 12-year deal, and he accepted the plea. And fortunately, he just got out. After 12 years, but that's 12 years I missed with my big brother. So I'm familiar with that part of it.
Right. And that's a scary thing too, because it's when you do enter a plea bargain, it's funny. The judge asks you, have you ever been coerced or intimidated to take this deal?
Yeah.
Well, you're like, I've been sitting in this damn jail.
You're coercing me right now. You're not my friend. This is a scary environment, etc. But well, that's part of I think what we'll get into today, because the very nature of the criminal justice system, it's sort of like a snake that's eating its own tail. It's a very weird, unusual thing. You would think that, like most places in the world, the criminal justice system is supposed to restore justice to society or harmed individuals and rehabilitate the criminals, and neither of those two things are true.
Very little of justice goes on.
Almost none. And then everybody is just okay with that. And so recently, obviously, there's been this push to rethink, what does it mean? Because if you're just used to it, if you're born into a world where the bad people go to jail and then they go back to jail and they go back to jail, that's just kind of the norm. And that's something we'll get into today. But a lot of folks recently have been rethinking what it means to actually lower crime. Obviously we talk about this a lot on the show, but the idea of defunding the police means reallocating police resources into community programs that prevent crime from happening in the first place. And believe it or not, there's a lot of people that don't want that to happen. Not just police, but like people that are in the prison business,
because that's their bread and butter.
Exactly. So the nature of criminal justice is very different. It's not meant. They don't want to rehabilitate it, and they lobby and they get politicians on their side, etc. And the ready assumption, and again we'll get into this a little later, but the ready assumption is that there needs to be a certain amount of criminals, as opposed to there will always be some number of criminals. And those are two different approaches to criminal justice. One is like, we need it to be at least here. One of them is that, well, we're always going to have some, so we need some institutions, but it's not an us versus them sort of situation. And so we'll get into that. One of the things that I do want to start the show off with is a fact. And for those that don't know, African Americans are incarcerated at a rate 5 times as much as whites, and then for Latinos it's almost 1.5 times as whites. And so the three of our groups make up a good amount of folks in this country. I'd say somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% ish, maybe more, with those three groups. And, you know, you being someone who can identify with being black and then obviously can identify with being a Latino man as well, have been able to see what that looks like, you know, along those color lines as well. And so what I want to get into first is, do prisons work? I think I know the answer, but let me qualify the question.
Okay, sure.
So, one thing that I want you to talk about is, I came across this. It's that the idea that low risk offenders, people who might do things like, you know, maybe they do a fraud thing, you know, maybe they see an opportunity to get ahead, whatever their story is. I don't know. I'm not trying to justify anything, but they do something and they're a low risk offender. They're also exposed to high risk offenders, or they kind of get introduced into this kind of school of crime. Have you seen anything like that?
Definitely. So what we can agree on, we'll just state, you know, some basic facts. So poverty begets crime. Mm-hmm. It's not like, oh, this certain demographic is, you know, a little bit more, has a propensity to do crime. It's not that. It's poverty. So a large part of what I'm seeing here lately is, you know, the opioid crisis. Okay. So we'll take, for example. So right now, there are people who, you know, for whatever reason, because doctors were prescribing OxyContin like it was Skittles back in the day. Okay. Now that there's the crackdown, a lot of these people are resorting to other drugs like fentanyl. Okay. So now to buy the illegal drugs is expensive. So there's no way you can work a regular job and in turn, you know, support your habit. Yeah. So a lot of these people will resort to crime. Sure. So I'll use, you know, just because it kind of feeds into, you know, other aspects, we'll use Walmart, for example. Sure. So Walmart at one point was part of a lobbying group called ALEC, and, you know, that can be looked up, and we can talk about that later on. So what they did is Walmart was getting hit over the head with these people going into their store and stealing. So let's say you stole something over a certain dollar amount. It could be deemed felony, but usually it got pleaded out to where it was a simple shoplifting. Well, now, because they were taking such losses, they then in turn had the law changed to where now if you steal something and you have intent, they can prove you had intent to steal. It's called an organized retail theft. So with an organized retail theft, that's a class 4 felony. So usually on your first time, if you get caught, you can get some type of probation or some type of like deferment program. But let's say, you know, it's your second time or whatever, and they decide to go ahead and push prison time to you. You're looking at 2.5. Now with a prior
2.5 years.
2.5 years.
Okay, not months.
But with a prior, the thing is when you get arrested though, they charge you, throw everything against you. So throw everything against the wall to see if it sticks. And then what happens is you have a historical prior. So with a prior, that same F4 now turns into 4.5 years. Okay. So that's 4.5 years. If you think about it, it's almost half a decade you're being locked up for. And I'm not saying stealing's right, but I think that's a little extreme that someone goes in and, you know, steals some items and the way the laws are written, those laws are still being changed now. I mean, there are people who go in and try to return things with, like, I knew a guy, he tried to return an item with his brother's ID. Mm-hmm. Walmart will give you store credit for it. Sometimes what they'll do is, but that's changed now. Now the game is if they catch you, that's an identity theft charge. You know, yeah. So they're trying to do that. And sometimes I even heard, depending on what you steal, they'll hit you with a burglary charge. You know, the days when people would go in and do a beer run and do things like that, they're considered some of this burglary. So these corporations now, because they have the ear of certain politicians and they're in league with them, it behooves them to push harsher sentences. Because then what happens is now these harsher sentences are given out. That's longer prison time. Longer prison time means more bodies to be put in these cages or to be warehoused.
Yeah.
And with private prisons here running rampant, I don't know if you've ever heard of CCA.
I think so.
Yeah, they're a private prison here, so they benefit immensely off of that because they need bodies. Like you said, we need that certain degree of something that maybe, 5-10 years ago wasn't such a large crime. Now, in turn, I can give you real prison time for it. And the rates are alarming because they target our communities, of course, where there's black and brown, poor people, black and brown people, and surprisingly, I've seen a lot of women who are been getting incarcerated. Before it was, the joke was, okay, well, they're nicer on ladies, but they're not stopping. Wow. And it's lockup. It's a big money grab.
Yeah.
So when you get into, okay, well, are we incarcerating people so that we can in turn rehabilitate them? Which it's all a joke. There's no rehabilitation. Or are we just, warehousing bodies so that then we can go ahead and, bilk the taxpayers for so much? Because a private prison gets typically about $32,000 per inmate. So as a private prison, I want to stack as many bodies, as many healthy bodies as I can, because, that $32,000 pays for my guards, pays for my food, and they try to run it at, the lowest possible cost, to where, the food rations you get are they barely hit the caloric requirements that you need.
You're saying it's not a lot of food, or it's not good?
Not a lot of food at all. And a lot of it is high carbs, something cheap, so you'll eat a lot of pasta, something that's cheap to feed a large population.
Okay.
Because they're trying to run a profit. Okay. So with that $32,000 per inmate, they have to clear after they pay all expenses, like I said, guards, food, clothing. They're charging inmates. They'll give them maybe issue 2 or 3 outfits, and then they'll charge them to buy other outfits. So now you have to pay, after you get a job on the yard. And typically, your jobs can pay anywhere from 15 cents to 50 cents an hour. So imagine having to buy clothing, on the yard with that money, which should be issued by the state, but.
And then with that amount of time, that's just even more time in that crime school, right? And go ahead.
So we'll take county jail.
Sure.
So in county jail, depending on how many times you've been there, and a lot of times, the statistics are unreal. How a lot of these people have mental illness.
Okay.
So a lot of times the mentally ill and homeless are picked on all the time. So you might have gone to jail. I knew a guy who was like, yeah, I've been arrested 30 times last year. And you're just like, that is an unbelievable amount of times to be arrested.
Really?
Oh, yeah. And, it might be just a turnaround. He might have something like paraphernalia, have a pipe on him or something, or a trespassing. And so it's a revolving door. So they get to clock every time they keep him in the jail. And what happens is the guy might be nonviolent. He just might have a drug habit. So with his drug habit, though, he progressively gets a higher ranking because the more times he's been to prison. So, there's times, too, and if there's any violence, which nowadays, if you have a domestic violence dispute, if you punch the wall, that's considered criminal damage. It's considered violent. So you might be in, you had a bad night with your wife, punched the wall, whatever. Well, you might be locked up with a murderer. A guy who, I just shot 2 of my cousins right now. Pass the bread. And so,
wow.
Yeah. And so, it's like, you look at this, and because of myself, I've been to prison. I've had violent crimes in the past. So now when I go in, I might go in for shoplifting, and my bunkie might be a murderer. To where I'm like, wait a minute here. I'm here for, simple shoplifting, trespassing, whatever. This guy is looking at 100 years. What's to say he's not going to stomp on my head in the middle of the night?
Sure.
So, it's definitely one of those situations where you have a certain degree of anxiety in the pod, as they call it. And then everything is run, is political. So when I say political, it's and it's something inmates do, and I don't know if it all started out as, to protect, but everybody's kind of separated by race.
Yeah, I know that.
And I mean, you'll even have guards that in turn will, talk to a certain race of people. So if you have a young kid who's becoming, problematic, they'll go to maybe the older guys in his race and be like, hey, talk to the youngster there, man. He's wilding out. And it keeps order to a certain extent, but at the same time, it keeps us all on edge at each other's throats. It's brown against black and black against white. And even there's Mexican nationals who are locked up in there, which, you wouldn't think there'd be a distinction, but there's actually high contention between Chicanos who live here and Paisas, as they call them, from Mexico. So a lot of times since I've been locked up, I've seen those two go at it, more so than the other races.
So one of the things that I read is that half, that's 50% of inmates return in the first 2 years of release.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned something about, the revolving door of, I'm guessing this person might have been homeless. You said he had
right.
a drug habit or something, which, again, at least on this show, we are of the persuasion that drug use is indicative of a health issue, not of criminal activity.
Right.
Be it mental health or otherwise, self-medicating for whatever your ailment is, or even for recreation, is not indicative of you're not harming anyone else or society by, that. That's just the persuasion that we are of on this program. So, to hear that half of the inmates return in 2 years or less suggests to me that prisons are not working in as far as rehabilitating people, because anything that you do where it only works half the time,
right.
that's not a passing grade for anywhere.
If you were to buy a product and it works half the time, yeah. Would you not return it?
I wouldn't get on the airline where half the flights make it back.
Yeah, only half of these make it here. And so so we'll go ahead and speak to the drug problem here.
Okay.
So where you look at other countries such as Amsterdam, Portugal, a lot of these they come with it as a compassionate approach, and they have higher success rates of people getting off drugs. Mm-hmm. And then you look at as far as the homeless situation. Number one reason for homelessness is there's usually loss of family, so there's no loss of support system. Mm-hmm. So now to have that demographic of society be so criminalized,
yeah,
it's horrible. And I'll just run you through a quick scenario.
Yeah, of course, please.
So you have a guy. He has a drug habit.
Mm-hmm.
He comes into a jail, hostile environment.
Yeah,
nobody's happy to be. Nobody wants to be there.
Yeah.
Let's say he's hurting really bad because the effects of getting off of an opioid. You actually feel physical pain. Mm. So now this person is at the mercy of those prisoners around him to be victimized. Hey, we don't want to see him. I mean, I've seen people, they come in and they're throwing up, and the guy's gotten beat up because he's, throwing up, making a mess. So, mind you, in that environment, horrible food, okay? I mean, they give rice on Friday sometimes where you're like, everyone looks forward to it. The rest is you get that sloppy gruel. It's really disgusting. It doesn't even look like it's fit for human consumption.
Yeah.
And now you're going to a courtroom full of people who don't look like you, who, you almost don't even understand a lot of the legalese they're speaking. And they pop a lawyer in front of you. Okay, hey, this is your public pretender, as we call it, or your public defender. Yeah. He's going to get you the best deal you can get. So a lot of times, guys will take deals, like you said, just to get out of that environment. So they came up with things because they were, I want to say it was back in maybe 97, 98. They came up with something called Prop 200.
Okay.
Now, this is going to be fun.
All right.
So Prop 200 came up, and what it was, they sold it to the public because drugs were affecting everyone's families. So there was an outcry, like, hey, you can't lock my little Johnny up, my sweet little, for drugs and give him a hard time with those other animals. Okay. So he came up with Prop 200. So it was kind of a diversion program. You went in. If you basically did probation, and if you got tested for drugs, they would keep you incarcerated for a little bit while. But it was basically they couldn't send you to prison on this drug because you had a drug problem. The problem with it was, so let's say Johnny had went in and he got caught with, for personal use, methamphetamine. He would then, let's say, they would have given him a sentence of 1.5, 2.5. Well, the thing is now with this Prop 200, Johnny has a problem that's not being addressed. And so he's coming in and out of prison, and they're, violation, here's 30 days. Violation, here's 60 days. And then they're letting him right back out for him to go ahead and get high again. Well, by the time he's done, after so much time, there are people who have been on this Prop 200 for 5 years. They could have done the prison time. They would have done less time incarcerated if they had just taken the original 1.5 or the 2.5, because he spent so much time in and out of jail, 2 months here, 3 months here, 90 days here, 6 months here. There's no way to keep any type of semblance of real. You can't keep a job. You can't hold an apartment. So this program that was made to help people, to keep them out of prison, actually crippled people. And in turns, people like that who are coming in and out, instead of addressing, because there's no real rehab.
That's what I was going to ask. Is there any? So if a person comes in off of the street,
right,
and they very clearly have a drug problem, or they're on drugs, or they're throwing up, as you say,
right.
Well, first, let me say something. So Q and I, we do a show called, or we do an outreach. We've done it for about 10 years now. It's called #Lunchbag,
right,
where we feed homeless people in downtown Phoenix. So this is a population that we're familiar with. We partner with CAS, the Central Arizona Shelter Services. We have a food pantry supplier, the Midwest Food Bank. We have lots of people that have supported these initiatives over the years, including this radio station and other media outlets as well. And of course, we have 1,000+ volunteer base. So this is a well-established outreach. This is the first I'm hearing, after 10 years of working with this population, that there's nothing for them if they end up incarcerated. I know that sometimes folks will disappear because the police pick them up for whatever, but my assumption has always been that, if they're involved in, the criminal justice system, that keeps them away from their habit long enough, at least to get them clean, or to they teach them something about like the harmful effects or anything like. Is there anything like that?
So prison economics, we'll go ahead. We can also get into that at one point. There's nothing in there. There's nothing on the streets that you can't get in prison. Just the way the prison economic system works out. Okay. And they might tell you, okay, well, we run this program or we run this program for people. Those programs are a joke. They really there's really no counseling. And the only people I've seen who've been successful usually do it on their own or decide to seek out religion. There's a lot of religious-based programs that are excellent. I knew a guy, he got himself clean. He decided to, give his life over to Mormonism.
Okay.
And they're very involved in there to where, they'll come visit you and things.
But as far as the state is concerned, the state programs are not.
I've heard like sometimes they'll give you they will give you some type of medication to kind of help out. Like if you get the DTs, if you have alcoholism.
DTs, what is that?
That's like where you get the shakes when you drink if you're an alcoholic.
Okay. Because
you have a physical dependency on that at some point to where, but very, very little. Like I said, there's no, and I've heard rumors that even that's gone. So sometimes they'll put you on, sometimes they'll give you like psychological meds to try to help with, but some of those things, it just seems like it's all like experimental drugs. It almost seems like.
Well, let me posit this.
Sure.
If what you're saying to me is that everything that's available outside of the prison is still available on the inside of the prison. Right. If you're saying to me that, there's no programs in there to really address the root of the issue, right. And I think that this is another point that a person can make, that, prisons are not working. Right. Not, I think the most telling statistic is still the fact that 50% of the folks are back in there after 2 years.
Well, the recidivism rate is even higher than that. Like just people who, that's within the first 2 years. Mm-hmm. It's like 85% recidivism rate of people who actually end up not coming back to prison. And it's funny because, there's a saying like, once you have a number, your hooks are in you. So if you get pulled over, something you might be able to get away with or get let go of, which a misdemeanor, you have a history, they love it. Hey, you've got a historical prior. We're talking prison. Do not pass go. So it's not like to where you can get certain, you're just you're not eligible for those programs.
This is something that really speaks to, I think, the black experience. I'll speak for black males, myself in particular. My whole life, I've never drank alcohol. I've never done any drug. I've never done anything, like that, because of my connection with, the police and those substances, right? And there's a lot of things I've never done because of, but it's very much shaped by police interactions with black men that I've seen in my lifetime. And again, I think it speaks to the fact that there's something in me that spoke to me at a young age that says, well, you know what? I can't be regular. I have to be better than regular in order to be good enough, right?
Correct.
And so I'm obviously not just for black and brown folks, but for anybody who's incarcerated. Once you're out, you have to be better than everyone in order to be good enough, because so you can't afford to make any mistake. If you have a New Year's Eve party and you have a toast of champagne and you drive home, that could be another
that's potential
prison time. I guess I never really thought about it in that way, but for me, I knew that for me at least, blackness was enough. I don't want to ever have a reason for these people to say anything to me, and so I've always kind of kept everything clean. So it's just very interesting that, that's the way that the prison system can change and shape outcomes. And I'd imagine it's obviously way worse for black and brown folks. And then the way they tell the story after they murder you for, it's like, well, he did one thing when he was 14 and, whatever.
Like, wait a minute. Yeah. So, you watch these shows and they bring up, well, when he was 17, he shoplifted, and make you sound like you're a terrorist a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, if you're just tuning into Civic Cipher, I'm your host, Ramses. Our guest today is Gonzo. He's talking to us about his time in prison. We're discussing whether or not prisons work, how effective they are. One of the most telling statistics that I've come across is that, and I'll say it exactly the way I have it, is that half of the inmates will return within 2 years of their release. Now, we talked about if there are drug rehabilitation programs. I do recognize that the way this country looks at drugs like it's a criminal issue. Not the whole country, because in Oregon, I know that they've recently changed the laws to where they started treating drugs like they're health issues and not criminal issues, which I'm really excited to see how that program works. There's going to be some people who don't like it, but those people that don't like it are people that stand to profit from those people being imprisoned. Everyone else, in terms of the way society works, should be happy, but because the effect of it should be that there's less crime, less things that qualify for crime because they're not crime, and then more people get healthy when we're able to realize that they have a problem. And then the neighboring state, I know they're two different places, but Seattle, I was just there. I was just in both these places, actually. In Seattle, there's a lot of homeless people there. For some reason, I didn't know this, but man, they treat the homeless people like super cool. They're just like kind of there, they're not, they're just people. They just happen to be unsheltered, and so that's super cool.
It's also really expensive to live in Seattle.
So so I guess that might, that might be part of it as well. But yeah, the drug rehabilitation, if they give you some medicine to help you kind of wean you off of it, that's okay. But in terms of like attacking the root of the problem, it doesn't seem like there's a whole lot that you've encountered that really takes place in the prisons. Now, what about folks where they very clearly have mental health issues? Do you know of any programs where, are there doctors, or are there anything like that you've encountered? So,
so to get back kind of to what we were talking about as far as, the jail is run like a business. So if I give you certain medication to keep you, stabilized off of whatever drug you're coming down from, that comes out of my profit. So they try to wean you off of that as quickly as possible. And if they can get something, because the feds, we look at it all as the government, but there's a difference between the state and federal.
Yeah.
So there's some programs that are supported by the feds, which is what they'll push. And this happens in prison a lot of times too, to where they'll push a program and it's really just a joke. They do it to get the funding for it. It's usually taught by some counselor who's ready to be retired, and they go through the bare minimums in order to qualify for the program. And now I know in jail a lot of times you might have like AA. But see, everything in the jail is a security issue. So a lot of times those meetings that you were depending on to go to, well, there's security. We can't let you out. You can't go. Especially now with the COVID, when they're short-staffed. Oh, we don't have anyone because they have to have a guard posted so that you can go ahead and go to those classes. So nothing overrides security there. So a lot of these programs that you think would go to help people, it's not happening at all. And to me, I've always saw that there was an excuse to where what they do offer, it's not enough to really help somebody who really, even if the person were serious about trying to change their life around, there's really no incentive for them to do it. They're just warehoused to where, okay, well, hey, I'm going to rock this time down and play some dominoes and maybe play some ball, and okay, my release date comes.
Now, you said something earlier. You talked about a person coming in and he's throwing up.
Right.
And then the people beat him up because he's throwing up.
Correct.
And you said he was making a mess. Now, I know that this goes without saying, but have you seen a lot in the way of violence in prison?
Yeah, violence is a way of life in there to a certain extent.
Okay, so talk about that a little bit.
So you have to think, you're in a small, encapsulated environment with no one who wants to be there. Mm-hmm. No one is getting happy news. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Every time they go to court, some of these guys are looking at some really serious time. Mm-hmm. So, I know the way that we're broken up in races, certain races, that's how they handle they discipline their people. So you get disciplined to where if you're out of line, let's say, guy's not taking a shower, that's unhygienic in that small area. So they beat the guy up. The guy might be on a power trip that day. And I've seen some really ugly things happen to where there's a certain rule set in prison, which I believe nowadays has been so watered down and it gets manipulated, because these are people, a lot of these guys are criminals. A lot of these guys are just the biggest assholes you will ever run into. People you would never, ever associate with, we say, in real life, mm-hmm. to where they see, they prey on the weak. So, I've seen it to where a guy is, okay, he'll get, some money from the front, commissary.
Okay.
Well, people will be like, oh, that guy's a snitch. I'm like, what? So usually you have to produce paperwork, but, mob rules. Oh, he's a snitch. So they beat him up and take his commissary. Now, if the guy decides, hey, I don't want to get beat up, and goes and tells the guard, that justifies, see, told you he was a snitch. So it's just like, you'll see things like that. So in order to survive, you have to fight. So it's a lot of times, I've had to fight people just because it's like fight one, fight 1,000, because you don't want to seem like an easy mark, because people will manipulate you in there. People will take advantage.
So I think that for someone, obviously, prison has affected my family.
Correct.
It cost me time with you.
Correct.
And I recognize that it is a problem just because, the reason that this very show exists is to give a voice to people who otherwise don't have a voice, especially in areas where one is necessary. And, for as far back as this country goes, this whole criminal justice system has been very unfair to black folks, especially brown folks as well. And it seems like nowadays it's unfair to everyone. It doesn't really seem like it's, working at all, based on the numbers that we're looking at. But there is one thing that I came across, and I want to get your thoughts on it because I have some thoughts on it as well. But there is a school of thought that says that mass incarceration over the past, we'll call it 30 years in this country, 30, 40 years, mass incarceration has led to a marked drop in violent crimes. Do you have any thoughts on that?
A lot of thoughts on
let's
that,
hear it.
actually. So violent crime, if you look at just historically, it's going to have an ebb and flow.
Okay.
Nowadays, it's not as profitable to do violent crime because usually the reason for doing crime, unless you're a sociopath, is to have financial gain. There's no reason to do. Why nowadays would I put a gun in your face when I can just steal on a computer or on a laptop and never have any interaction?
Right.
So I think that's what's contributing to it more so than the whole, we're incarcerating more people, because those crimes, if you take the numbers of property crime and you take the numbers of white collar crime and compare that to the drop in violent crime, well, you've just replaced one crime with another.
Sure.
So, and also as a society, we're moving away from violence to where it's frowned upon. I mean, think about it. When's the last time you saw a fight in the street? To where I know growing up, that was every other day.
Yeah.
I think just as a society, we're changing. So I think that's a misleading statistic when they're like, well, look, we're incarcerating more people, so violence is going down. I don't think that has anything to do with it whatsoever.
Sure.
Now, as far as the mass incarceration, I know a lot of people are getting rich.
Yeah, there you go.
Are getting rich off of this because it's this whole industry. I mean, you look at there's like the little podunk towns like Florence, Arizona, which has a majority of prisons down there.
Yeah.
Those tax dollars keeps that population working.
Yeah.
And, those tax dollars that goes into that little city, if you look at them, I think down there, too, I think the tax rate's a little bit higher. I think it's like 12% on sales tax. It's
specifically for the prisons?
Well, it's not specifically for the prisons. It's to keep the town going.
Oh, okay.
So, but the majority of everyone in that town works in the prison.
Yeah.
So, in turn, you're just, you're reallocating money. So, the state basically is paying these people to keep this town going.
You know what blows my mind is that, almost behind every single curtain, not like behind two or three, it's not levels, like layers involved. It's just behind every curtain at almost every level of politics or anything, especially things that affect black folks, brown folks, poor folks, and young folks. There is a huge cash grab.
Always.
And it's the wildest thing. And then I'm not one of those people who's not patriotic, right? I love this country, same as anyone else, right? I get emotional when I see the flag at the end of the movie and all that.
Star Spangled Banner.
Yeah, I live here too. I'm born in California.
I'll bleed to keep the stripes red.
There you go, right?
Yeah,
I love that.
Right.
But this idea that some people have that this is the greatest country in the world in the history of the, and they're just, it's like, do we see the same thing that's happening here?
I mean, we're great at incarcerating people.
Yeah, there's some things that we're number one
right,
at. Yeah, and I think I saw a list not too long ago that said the things that the USA is actually number one at. And there's all these terrible things, and then all the things that, are metrics that you would use to measure a society are actually, we're pretty near the bottom. We can't take care of people's health. We obviously have, issues with, people having safe lives on the street, and we're not addressing that in the proper way.
I've been fortunate enough to be to a few places, and I've seen how it runs. And listen, this is a great country.
Yeah, of course.
It's just one of these things as far as, this incarceration thing, and it goes so deep, and it's like the public has been so fooled that I really think it's almost like we have to re-educate the public on what's actually going on, because they'll give something and they'll sell it to the public in one way, and the public will be like, hey, that sounds like the Prop 200. Hey, that sounds like a great idea. let's not send these young kids who have a drug problem to prison. But then when you actually look at the way the program is laid out and it's the way it's actually working out, it's horrible.
Yeah.
And I think the powers that be plan this. They know what's going on.
Oh, listen, I'll tell you this. So I went to school. So my bachelor's is in marketing.
Sure.
My master's is in management. I just say that because I can.
Wonderful thing.
Yeah. But so I went to school to learn marketing at Arizona State, W.P. Carey. So it was a good school.
Right.
And one of the things that we learn in school is that sex sells, right? But there's something that I learned when I got out of school, when I became an adult and was able to function in the real world where things really happen. And I realized there's something that sells easier, faster, and it's more readily available than even sex. Fear. That's it. If you can get these people afraid of something, man, you nailed it. I didn't know if you would have seen that coming, man, but I should have known better. I should have known better.
Listen, people will make horrible decisions
out of fear.
And just even people who I've been close to, even with this COVID situation and some of the other things, they're just like, well, hey, you know what? I'll give up civil liberties if it means I'm safe.
Yeah.
And that just really, I'm just like, wow, it's you know, it's frightening. So.
You know, I think it might have been maybe Edward Snowden or one of those guys that love him or hate him. He said something like, you're on. He was talking about like your online privacy. Like the privacy of the contents of your telephone, the privacy of everything. Why it's so important to keep that separate from the government.
Right.
And to people, a lot of folks says, well, I got nothing to hide. So, it's fine. Let's grant the government access to catch the bad guys or whatever. Right. And this guy made a statement that I thought was so profound. He says something to the effect of, well, saying, I don't need rights to my privacy because I have nothing to hide is akin to saying, I don't need freedom of speech because I have nothing to say. And I thought that was such a profound statement that it stuck with me. But I do want to get back to what we were talking about, that argument that mass incarceration has led to, a drop in violent crime. Right. If I were to challenge that, I've talked with some people, one person in particular, her name is Zara. She works with Black Lives Matter, Phoenix Metro in Arizona, where I live. Where we live, and she made a great point, and this is something that if you really think about it, it makes sense. A lot of the mass incarceration didn't come from violent criminals at all. That wasn't what it was. It came from this misguided war on drugs, and I don't know if many people know the name Brian Stevenson, but that's someone very much worth looking into. He runs an initiative called the Equal Justice Initiative. They actually did a movie about him, and Michael B. Jordan stars in the movie. But I've known this guy and watched him for a very long time because he's kind of one of the heroes that I look up to. Anyway, there's this misguided war on drugs that again affects communities where drugs were deliberately put into those communities by the very government that imposed the laws onto those communities.
Gotta watch it; they're coming after you if you say.
And the thing is, sometimes people will hit me up online and they'll say things like, black people are always playing the victims, or those troll sorts of folks. People are not taking responsibilities, whatever. Or they have this sort of delusional view of the facts, and. And I say that as often as I can, but the government has admitted to these things. The government it will stand by it. Yeah, we did that. Right. These are things that we did. And this is what we're currently doing now. You know what I mean? These statistics are like it's on Google. Like you can Google it yourself, Right. And there's to steal a phrase, this stunning silence. Like everybody sees it happening, And there's not, and so in our own way, I'd like to talk about it. But yes, this misguided war on drugs that takes folks with an entrepreneurial spirit. That might be me putting it kindly. Right, I'll admit that.
I've heard this argument before.
Yeah, but that might be me putting it kindly. But I think it rings true. Mm-hmm. Taking advantage of the resources that they have at their disposal. I see how the money's moving in the environment that I'm in. I recognize the pitfalls, and I get out there and I play the game. So either I'm going to steal food, or I'm going to hustle to make enough money to have food. People do a lot when they're hungry, or when, there's, I come from California, so the gap between poor and rich is way bigger than in a lot of places. Right. Because on the same street where you have to drive to the grocery store, or you have to drive to go get food stamp, whatever it is that you're doing, on that same street you could drive, and there's Ferraris and Rolls Royces using that same street. Right. And that will motivate you to do something eventually. And that's not to say that people can't have nice things and that the poor won't always be with us, but I think that there's certainly something to be said about when the poor have really nothing and they're starving and they're scraping to get by, and the rich have way more than any human being could ever do anything with in a lifetime, or 2 or 10.
I mean, we'd have to almost do a whole nother show.
Yeah, that's a different show. Fair point.
Right,
fair point.
Just on like poverty and even the effects of the school system, of how schools are funded, to where it's like a prison to a school to prison pipeline. That's what they're causing a lot of time. But so back to as far as with the drop in violent crime, I just feel that's naturally where we're headed as a society. Right. So where if there's something, as you say, like let's say this COVID, and there's no jobs and there's nothing, we'll definitely see an uptick in violence. Yeah. So I think just where we are society-wise, the way crime is done a lot of times, crime is done, like you said, to obtain financial goods. And violence it's not the easiest way to do it now. And also taking that into effect, it's funny because we would always say, like when we're in jail, you'll see someone and there's always that person who's never had any encounter with the cops and now is coming to jail. And, I know my rights and this isn't right. This is not supposed to happen. And like, welcome to the real world.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way in the prison walls.
Does not work at all. And you'll see that. And it's, you'll see the difference in sentencing along racial lines.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you'll look at, like you said, take violence. Mm-hmm. So if I go into a bank and I wave a gun around and say, hey, this is a robbery. And now that was becoming so prominent at one time that usually that was always a federal crime. Mm-hmm. Now, sometimes if the person didn't get away with enough money, or there's not enough, instances of them doing the bank robbery, they'll kick that to the state. So it's nothing to, okay, hey, I robbed a bank with a gun. Usually that would go federal. No, they'll let the state have it. So I've seen that to where, or someone who goes in and passes a note. Very, very different sentencing guidelines when it comes to that now. Because if you use a weapon during a crime, I mean, you can look anywhere from 5 to 12. Okay. To where if you just passed a note and robbed a bank, and you tell her, hey, I'm going to blow this place up if you don't give me money. I've seen people get away with, 2.5, 3. I saw this one guy, it was funny, all American, blonde hair, blue eye guy. Mm. He had done a few banks where he had robbed it with a note. So we're like, man, you're done, kid. You know what I mean? They got you. Well, his lawyer came in and they were offering 3 years. Well, his lawyer's like, don't take that, sweetie. We're going to go ahead and work that down for you.
Wow.
We're like, wait a minute, this guy robbed multiple banks.
How about that?
And then on the flip side, who could say I've seen guys who do a home invasion, they're getting 12 years right off the gate.
And so, yeah. Right. Yeah, so I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that, sentencing, the way sentencing is passed down it's very, I guess confusing is not the right word, but inconsistent. We'll say that.
And that's the problem with the inconsistency of it all. And then that's the problem when you get mandatory minimums. You know, it's like, well, does this qualify for this? And to me, very, very, very racist. So they have this program now. It's funny to where if you're a repeat offender, it's called, you know, the repeat offender program, but they label it ROPE. So it brings up, you know, like you're being lynched. Like,
wow.
Right. So when you go in there, and so you go in, and
I don't mean to laugh. That's
no,
terrible.
it is. It's funny,
but it's so on the nose.
It's so on the nose. You have to do it. So, you know, so we'll go in. You go in with a procession of people, and you sit in a jury box when you're incarcerated to address the judge.
Sure.
So your lawyers will come by and they'll talk to you. And then if you see the prosecution's desk and you see that pink file and with your name on it, that means you've been roped.
Oof.
And, you know, people make joke about it like, oh, they roped you. Like, wow. And that is really how it is. And they take pride in it. They think that's hilarious. And not seeing that that's the most racist thing.
Yeah.
And listen, the sentencing guidelines, if you're roped, are almost double what it would normally be. So back to what I was telling you, that felony 4, well, now you're looking at 7.5, 9s.
Yeah.
You know, I've known guys who stole video games, got 16 years.
What a
Yeah.
Well, I think that so I want to say this. You know, I read a report about a prison that had a contract with the state. They're going to build this new prison, and they need to have 85% capacity. You can't go below that, or else, you know, whatever. And so the state has promised that we're going to have 85% of your prison filled up to this company that built the prison, right? And I think that to make a promise like that,
it's a little nasty, isn't it?
Well, I think it's beyond nasty.
Right.
It's. I think it's. What's the word I want to use? It flies in the face of what the state should be pursuing, which is the exact opposite.
Right.
We want this prison to be at most 10% full. Right. You know what I mean? We don't want to have to use the prison. We want people to be free. We want there to be no crime. We want a society where there's no harm. Everyone is harmonious and things are equitable, and we really don't have to worry about this sort of thing. Obviously, crime is going to be with us in large, complicated societies, but to promise anyone 85% incarceration, I think that sets into motion a chain of events, actions, you know, and
that are more
ideas,
than improper. Yeah.
Right, with the sentencing and the policing, and you know, and neighborhoods that are overly policed, etc. And you know, at the end of the day, when we look at, you know, I think just the repeat offender rate, you know, like I said, within 2 years, 50% of the folks will be back in the very prisons that they left. And I think that speaks to the fact that there's not only corruption, there's not only backwards promises. You know, the state should have a promise and an obligation to society, not to prisons. You know, and that goes from the governor in Arizona. His name is Doug Ducey, all the way down to the people who are policing on the streets. You know, and all these people are civil servants that have a commitment to society, to better society, and understanding that you're a part of a system that's corrupt doesn't exempt you from participating in that corruption. You know, you have a moral obligation. The universe will get you eventually, you know? And so I think that when you take all of this stuff and you mix it together in the same pot and you see that prisons are not working, it really, at the very least, should cause you to take a step back, pause, and reflect on what exactly are we doing here. But we're out of time for this episode. So I want to thank you, Gonzo, for coming to hang out with me here on Civic Cipher today. And I want to invite all of the listeners of the show, if you have any questions, any topics you want us to discuss, if you want to donate, we appreciate all the donations. This show is supported by you. Please head over to civiccipher.com and follow all of our social media at Civic Cipher, and we'll see you next week. All right? Peace.